The old town hall was a weathered place, its wooden benches creaking under the weight of the crowd. The exposed beams in the ceiling hinted at decades of use, and a faint smell of dust hung in the air. But that evening, the energy inside was anything but stale. People had gathered for a rare event in this quiet little town. Charlie Kirk, the well-known commentator and speaker, was holding a community meeting. The microphone stand on the stage glinted metallically, a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of the room, as if it were the only modern thing in a space frozen in time. In the front row sat a boy, about 10 years old, named Eli. His sandy hair was slightly tousled, and his bright eyes sparkled with curiosity. He sat next to his mother, Susan, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as he watched the bustle around him. Susan glanced at him now and then, offering a small smile. She'd been surprised when Eli insisted on coming to this event. It wasn't like him to care about such things. For weeks, he'd been asking questions about God, why he existed, why life was so hard sometimes, why prayers didn't always seem to work. Susan had struggled to answer, often falling back on, "I don't know, but we'll figure it out someday." But Eli's curiosity hadn't faded. It had only grown. The hall was packed. Farmers, teachers, retirees, a handful of teenagers, they were all there for different reasons. Some knew Charlie Kirk from TV, drawn to his sharp ideas and straightforward style. Others were just looking for something to do on a night when nothing else was happening in town. Charlie stepped up to the podium, dressed casually in jeans and a button-up shirt, exuding his usual confident ease. "Hey, everyone," he said, his voice cutting through the room and grabbing attention. "We're here tonight to talk about real stuff. I want your questions, anything, no holding back, because truth starts with questions." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few hands went up and then dropped, unsure. But then Eli's small hand shot into the air. Charlie's gaze landed on him, a slight grin tugging at his lips. "All right, the young man in the front row," he said, pointing at Eli. "What's on your mind?" Eli swallowed hard. He gripped his mother's hand for a moment, then mustered his courage. His voice was soft but steady. "Why does God exist? And if he does, why does everything get so hard sometimes?" The room fell silent. Breaths were held, eyes darted from Eli to Charlie. It wasn't just a simple kid's question. It was the kind of thing everyone had wondered at some point, but rarely dared to voice aloud. Charlie held the microphone, studying Eli for a beat, before turning to the crowd. "That," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and admiration, "is an incredible question. And you know what, kid? Asking something like that shows you've got guts. That kind of courage can change the world." Eli's cheeks flushed slightly, but he kept his eyes on Charlie. Charlie stepped forward, his voice growing firmer. "Now, before I answer, let me say this. Big questions deserve big answers. And when someone like you asks one, it means we all need to stop and think. So let's dive in. Why does God exist? That's one of the oldest questions in human history. And to me, the answer's pretty clear. Because everything has to have a beginning." He paused, gauging the room. "Think about the universe," he continued. "Stars, galaxies, Earth, you, me. Did all this just happen by accident? Even science tells us the universe had a starting point, the Big Bang, right? Well, who set off that bang? Nothing comes from nothing, folks. For something to exist, there's got to be a cause, a designer. That's God. That's where logic and faith meet." A few heads nodded in the crowd. Eli's brow furrowed slightly, like he was piecing it together but not fully convinced yet. Charlie noticed and smiled, pressing on. But let's get to your second question, Eli. Why does everything get so hard sometimes? That's the personal part. If God's there, why's there pain? Why's there loss? Why does life feel unfair? Let me tell you a story. Charlie's voice softened, though it still carried that signature clarity. A few years back, I met a mom in Michigan named Lisa. Her husband had died in a car crash. She lost her job soon after, and she was raising two little kids on her own. Rent was piling up, food was running low. Most people would have given up, right? Not Lisa. Every night she'd sit with her kids and pray, not for miracles, not for money, just for enough strength to get through one more day. And guess what? She found it. The crowd stirred. Susan squeezed Eli's hand tighter, her eyes locked on Charlie. He went on. Lisa told me something I'll never forget. Faith isn't waiting for someone to save you. It's knowing you've got the strength to save yourself and believing God gave you that strength for a reason. That mom taught me more about faith than any sermon I've ever heard. God didn't create us to be puppets, Eli. He gave us free will, so we'd have choices, make mistakes, but also choose love, courage, and goodness. The world's not perfect because we're not perfect, but God's with us, even in the tough stuff. Eli's eyes widened, his lips parting slightly. Charlie looked straight at him. Now, you might ask, why doesn't God just make it all easy? Because an easy life doesn't grow us. Hardship shapes who we are. Lisa's kids are alive and doing okay today because she didn't quit. Faith isn't always about finding answers. It's about trust. Trusting that even when life's rough, love and strength will carry you through. The room came alive. People glanced at each other, some wiping tears discreetly, others nodding as Charlie's words sank in. A shy smile crept onto Eli's face, like he'd grasped something, but was still mulling it over. Charlie stepped off the stage, weaving through the crowd until he reached Eli. He crouched down to eye level. "Keep asking those questions, Eli," he said, his tone genuine. Finding God isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions. And love. Love through it all. That's where God hides. The crowd erupted into applause. It started with a few, then spread to everyone. Not a polite clap, but something deeper, more heartfelt. People stood, some crying, others looking around as if to hold on to the moment. Eli's question hadn't just gotten an answer. It had reminded everyone of something they carried inside, whether they'd known it or not. Susan looked at her son, her eyes welling up. "That was a great question," she whispered, pulling him close. Eli hugged her back, but his gaze stayed on Charlie. The room buzzed as people began talking, sharing stories. An older man stood up from the back. In his 60s, his face weathered by years, he spoke with a gravelly voice. "Charlie," he said, steady but emotional, "I lost my son last year. He was 34. I've been mad at God, mad at everything since then. But hearing you talk about Lisa, maybe I've been looking for God in the wrong place. Maybe it's in love, not anger." Charlie nodded, his expression one of deep respect. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, "but sharing that takes real strength. People like Lisa show us God leaves a light, even in the darkest times. It's up to us to find it." The room quieted again, a peaceful hush settling in. A few rows away, a woman in her 30s stood, clutching the hand of the man beside her, tears streaking her face. "I grew up in a strict religious house," she said, her voice trembling. "We were told to fear God, follow every rule, or we'd be punished. I ran from it all as soon as I could, but it left me empty. Hearing you talk about love, maybe faith can be about hope, not fear." Charlie smiled at her. "Absolutely," he said. "Faith shouldn't be about fear. God's about connection, through love, with ourselves, each other, something bigger. Hope's what keeps us going, even in the dark." She nodded, leaning into the man beside her. Susan finally spoke up. "Thank you for answering my son's question," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's been asking about God for months, and I didn't know what to say. Tonight, I think you gave him exactly what he needed to hear." Charlie turned to her. "You've done an amazing job," he said. "A kid like Eli asking questions like that? That comes from curiosity, courage, and love. That says a lot about you as a mom." Eli glanced at Susan, a small smile spreading wider, pride lighting up her face. The hall had transformed into more than a meeting. It was a space of shared vulnerability. Strangers started exchanging stories. An elderly woman with a cane told the young couple beside her how faith carried her through her husband's death years ago. A man in his 40s, still in his work uniform, whispered something to the woman next to him, wiping his face. And in the middle of it all, Eli sat, his shoulders relaxed, as if a weight had lifted. Charlie walked back to Eli through the crowd. He crouched again, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're going to do big things someday," he said. "Keep asking those big questions. They're what make the world better." Eli's shy smile returned. "Okay," he whispered. As the evening wound down, the energy in the room shifted. Lighter, warmer, still electric. People lingered, drawn together by what they'd shared. Charlie returned to the podium for a final word. "What happened here tonight wasn't about me," he said. "It was about connection, about love, about the guts it takes to ask big questions like Eli did. The world feels divided, but moments like this remind us what matters. Not what pulls us apart, but what brings us together. That's love, the quiet kind we show every day." The applause came again, stronger, more united. Eli and Susan headed for the exit, but Charlie caught up to them. He crouched to Eli's level once more. "You've got a gift," he said gently. "Don't ever lose it." Eli beamed with pride. "I won't," he said softly. Susan, eyes brimming, added, "He'll never forget this." They weren't the only ones changed. The crowd stayed, strangers swapping stories, handshakes turning to hugs. Charlie stood in the emptying hall for a moment, taking it in. Eli's question hadn't just touched the audience, it had touched him too. Moments like this proved life's worth wasn't in the answers we hold, but in the questions we dare to ask.